So continuing with this essay by Davis, Defining Engineering, let's put aside for the moment the question of defining engineering, and let's look at some of the things that Davis says along the way, which I think are quite contentious, actually. At the center of this essay is a hypothetical, which is really has to do with engineering ethics. It is a sort of typical problem that involves the first canon, the whole paramount canon. And Davis has some very definite ideas about how an engineer should behave in such a situation. We have a situation where an engineer suspects that the concrete that's being used in this chemical mixer is not satisfactory, and then the question is, what does he or she do? Obviously, he thinks that there's a lot that needs to be done. The first step is sort of not signing off on it, which is not only a question of the first canon, obviously, but maybe the fourth canon too, because certain things about the contract had to do with legal responsibility, and you wouldn't sign off on something that was substandard, at the very least, to protect your company. But the question is, what more should be done, or what more might be done? And Davis, as you can see, has very definite ideas that more needs to be done, and that ultimately it needs to be done because of the first canon. That is that you can't engage in an engineering project which is unsafe, which endangers the public, and the public here is basically the workers who would be working around this piece of machinery. Davis has very definite ideas about what you need to do if you don't get satisfaction. Not only going as high up as you can in your company, but ultimately, if you don't get satisfaction there, going to some outside authority. He seemed to think that this is obvious. Maybe it's not, as we'll see as we look into the first canon, that there are differing interpretations of it. That is, just what sort of obligations that the first canon actually lays upon engineers, and what they really need to do to fulfill the first canon is really the second part of this course. But that's a discussion that we'll be having for many weeks in this course, so we can put it aside. Why is Davis going through this hypothetical, and what does he want to establish thereby? Well, one of the things he wants to say, I think, is something about codes of ethics in general, and how they relate to engineering education in general. He says on page 4 that engineering education seems to hardwire much of engineering ethics into engineers, and that is a very interesting sort of thing to say, and that's something that you sort of have to decide for yourself, whether your own education has actually sort of implicitly pushed you to think ethically. There's your technical education, your engineering education has actually pushed you or molded your thinking in certain ways, that you also have a certain ethical judgment that arises from that. Now that's an important point for Davis, where he says, for instance, on page 8, he says a code of ethics might be implicit in the technical standards all engineers share. And then he goes on to say he has his hypothetical American engineer say to his Chinese counterpart, surely you cannot believe risking their lives like that would be good engineering, and you want your engineering to be good, right? That is one of Davis's and perhaps his major point in this essay, is that along with the technical education and training that engineers receive, that an aspect of that training, or what comes along naturally with that training, is a certain ethical outlook. That is, that it's not sort of an extraneous ethical problem, his hypothetical, that is imposed upon an engineering problem. That the engineering problem is an ethical problem, that the ethical problem is an engineering problem, seems to be what he's getting at. That is, it wouldn't just be immoral to put the public at risk unnecessarily. It would be bad engineering. And that this ethical judgment is part and parcel of the technical judgment. That notion of judgment, of course, is quite important. For instance, he says on page 7, the American engineer is enchanted to exercise judgment, his American engineering judgment. If he does not do that, he might as well have stayed home, sending an installation manual instead. Since part of American engineering judgment is ethical, as the codes of ethics make clear, the American engineer must bring his ethical judgment with him. Indeed, it is part of his technical judgment, and there too you get this idea that ethical and technical judgment can actually be separated. That is, that if you are properly educated as an engineer technically, you are at least implicitly also being educated ethically, so that a bad ethics is just bad engineering, and that your training, your education, pushes you obviously towards good engineering, so it also pushes you towards good ethics. Also, this notion of judgment, that is, again, what separates an engineer from a non-engineer who works with technology for Davis just is that judgment. That is, that capacity to exercise judgment. That is, to figure out a solution where there is no obvious sort of way to reach one mechanically or algorithmically. That is, that you need to use your expertise in exercising a practical judgment about what the best solution is to an engineering problem. That the molding of that capacity for engineers to do that, to exercise engineering judgment, is at the same time the molding of an ethical judgment, the capacity to make good ethical judgments. And that, again, Davis thinks maybe it's not obvious what an engineer should do in the kind of situation where that he sets up in his hypothetical, but that if you sort of stick with your education and training, of course you wouldn't build something that would pose an unnecessary risk to the public. It would be, first of all, bad engineering, and secondly, it would, of course, be unethical. What sort of comes out of this? Well, of course, one of the things that he wants to say here, and his reason for giving it this global aspect, where you have an American engineer working in China, is that his claim really, I think, seems to be that all engineers more or less think alike when it comes to engineering. And that is because they belong to a profession, a culture, an institution that has a common set of values, which are instilled through a common education. He says, for instance, on page 10, this conclusion may explain what might otherwise seem quite odd. Codes of engineering ethics, even those adopted by national engineering societies, typically apply to engineers without qualification, not to American engineers, German engineers, or Japanese engineers. The codes are also quite similar. The explanation for that unexpected indifference to what most of us consider important, our nationality, should now be clear. Engineers are engineers the world over, defined by a common culture. And that notion that there is a common culture called engineering is really key, I think, and at least in my reading, to understanding what Davis's actual answer is to the definition of engineering. It is not, again, a linguistic definition. It's rather pointing out that there is a certain culture, a certain institution, a certain group of practice called engineering, and that engineers are people who belong to that institution or culture. Again, on page 10, he says the definition of engineering, it arises from the analysis of the problem presented here, clearly is not a classical abstract definition, genus and species, necessary and sufficient conditions, or anything of the sort. What I have done is point out an institution or practice, the profession of engineering. So what is engineering? Engineering is a practice or institution which has a certain, the members of which have a common technical background, technical training, education, and what comes along with that, a common set of ethical assumptions. That's the idea of the hard wiring. That is, if the engineering codes did not exist, there still would be an implicit ethical code of engineering because that code is implicit in the actual culture of engineering, and all people who have been assimilated, who have become members of that culture or institution, are more or less going to share the same basic ethical outlook, whether there is a formalized code of ethics or not. Because of course, not all countries have these codes of ethics. Not all, I know I've done a little research, and there are some other countries that have ethical codes. There are some that have gotten them quite recently, I believe. But ethical codes are sort of like constitutions. They don't have to be written down. In America we've always had a written constitution. The English or the British have a constitution. It's just it is not actually a written formal constitution, but they have certain ideas about how power is distributed through the different branches of government, and how government is established and things like that, which are really a matter of tradition rather than some document. So the idea is that engineers have a common culture, and a common ethics, whether that ethics is formalized into an ethical code or not. And to be an engineer is to be a member of that culture. Again, he says on page 10, engineers were instead identified by a common curriculum, imparting a common discipline, a culture, that is, a shared way of doing certain things, the distinctive way of doing things we call engineering. Now, he has some things to say about the end of this, about who's an engineer and who's not. Even people who sort of call themselves engineers, and I think he excludes software engineers from really being engineers. Which I don't know enough about to know if there's any basis for that. But he says, software engineers could become engineers in the full sense if they actually change the curriculum for software engineers. Now, he doesn't specify what those changes are. There's a lot of claims in this essay which aren't exactly backed up. I would have to, do a lot more research into engineering to decide a question like whether software engineers are really engineers. I kind of assumed that they were. So we don't get a real definition or what he calls a linguistic or I don't know, abstract definition of what engineering is. Instead, the answer to what engineering is really pointing at the world. Engineering is what engineers do, and what engineers do is more or less defined by the common culture of engineers, and that culture is global. That is, that it transcends local differences in custom and ethics, and that engineering has its own ethics, which, again, this is a claim that he makes. I'm not quite sure it's true, but